more missiles. So that'll take us then to Thursday of the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 18th. President Kennedy has returned from his visit to Connecticut, and he sits down and meets with the ExComm committee to see what was discussed basically while he was gone. Now, he's given more information prior to the meeting. What type of information might he have been given prior to the meeting that didn't have anything to do with ExComm? What are we continuing to do, especially after we found out about these missiles?
Keep an eye on them.
And how are we doing that? We are continuing to do the photographic flights. And so Kennedy gets more information from some recent photos that were taken on a more recent spy plane mission to Cuba. And what it showed in these new photos, that they actually spotted 40 missiles on the ground in Cuba. Before, we just took a flight over. Did we really count the missiles? We didn't even know they were missiles. We just took pictures of things on the ground. Well, the second flight was more detailed, and it actually determined that there were probably 40 missiles on the ground in Cuba. 40. And they actually had a longer range capability than what they had anticipated, stating that now they could probably reach what? Every major city in America. So before his meeting with ExComm on Thursday morning, October 18th, President Kennedy was given more information from photos that were taken on a recent spy plane mission, and these new photos were developed, and it showed possibly 40 missiles on the ground in Cuba, and it was estimated that these missiles really had a longer range ability than they had first anticipated. Again, they would be able to really reach every major city in the country.
How did they find that out?
Because they found out in more detail what type they were. Okay? Now, this is a pretty key conversation that you know about. During this meeting with ExComm, President Kennedy asked General Curtis LeMay to brief him and to give him his recommendations on the situation in Cuba. Now remember, who was General Curtis LeMay? He was the head of which branch of the service? Yeah, these are things you got to know. What's that? Air Force. Okay, so Kennedy asked Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who's on the ExComm committee, to give him a briefing and give him his recommendation on what should be done. And LeMay recommended these two things. I need you to write these down, then I'm going to tell you about the conversation that General LeMay has with President Kennedy, and I don't really want you to write that down, I want you to absorb that. But here are the two recommendations that LeMay gave Kennedy. First of all, he recommended immediate airstrikes in Cuba. Did not want to wait any longer. He recommended immediate airstrikes. And that recommendation was justified by his second recommendation. And we'll kind of explain that. So his first recommendation was immediate airstrikes on Cuba. He did not want them to wait. And his second recommendation is they needed to destroy those missile construction pads as soon as possible. So LeMay's recommendation to the president was immediate airstrikes on Cuba, and two, the destruction of those missile launching pads that were still under construction. They had to be destroyed. Why did he recommend that? What was his purpose behind that? What did he not want to happen? Right, he did not want those, this is a term you hear a lot, he did not want those missile construction sites to become operational. Because once they become operational, they have the ability to put the missiles in and send them. So again, LeMay briefed President Kennedy. He gave his recommendations. Number one, he recommended an immediate airstrike on Cuba. And two, he recommended the destruction of those missile launching pads immediately. Because he did not want those to become operational, have the ability to launch the missiles. Now, here's basically the conversation. I want you just to listen to this, and I want to see what your reaction will be. This is General Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, talking to President Kennedy and giving him his recommendations. LeMay says to Kennedy, all you got to say is go, and my boys will get those red bastards. Kennedy's response to that, is, "You really think that's our best course of action?" That's what Kennedy asked. Basically, when he said, "All you got to do is say go, and we'll get those, my boys will get those red bastards," he's talking about communist people. Kennedy asked if he really thinks that's the best course of action. "Do you really think that's our best course of action?" He was asking him sincerely. Here was LeMay's comment to the president. You listen to this and take what you can out of it. "Mr. President, I believe this is our only course of action. America is in danger. The big red dog is digging in our backyard, and we are justified in shooting him. And sir, given your own statements about Cuba, I think a blockade or a bunch of political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as a pretty weak response. I suspect many of our own citizens would feel the same way. You're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President." Kennedy's response was, "What did you say?" LeMay kind of repeated himself, and Kennedy ended the conversation with, "Well, maybe you haven't noticed, but you're in it with me." So that was the conversation LeMay had. What's he telling the president? We can't take a chicken response to this, okay? We have no other course of action. America's in danger here. The big red dog is digging in our backyard, and we are justified in shooting him. He's telling the president, we are justified in airstrikes followed by invasion. We're justified in doing that. And he basically goes on and says, any other course of action like a wimpy blockade or bunch of political talk just makes you look like an idiot, is basically what he's telling the president. Makes you seem weak. And then when he says, you're in a pretty bad fix, Mr. President, that irritated the president. And he looked at him, he said, what did you say? And he repeated himself, and he said, well, if you haven't noticed, you're in it with me. Then he settles down, because he did get angry at General LeMay, and he asked LeMay what he thought Russia's response would be if we airstruck and invaded Cuba. He said, basically, what do you think Russia's response is going to be? What do you think General LeMay's response was? He said, nothing. The president looked at him kind of funny, and he said, what do you mean, nothing? Now listen to this and tell me what you get out of this. This was LeMay's response when the president said, what do you mean, nothing? He said, nothing, because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose. Let me repeat that. LeMay said they'd do nothing in response to us attacking Cuba. The president said, what do you mean nothing? And LeMay says, nothing, because the only alternative open to them is one they can't choose. What does that mean?
They can't launch their missiles, right?
Well, yeah, the only alternative they have is to take West Berlin.
Oh.
And if they take West Berlin, we're going to respond, and then they're going to respond, and pretty soon we got nuclear missiles going back and forth. So LeMay believes they'll do nothing because the choice they have, they can't afford to do, because what it'll lead to. President Kennedy then said to him, quote, if we kill Soviet soldiers, and there are Soviet soldiers on the ground in Cuba, those are the guys getting these missile launching pads ready, they're going to respond. I mean, how would we respond? They're going to do something, General. I will promise you that. So, what's Kennedy thinking their response is going to be? Berlin, without doubt. Okay, and so Kennedy's thought were if the Soviet Union would strike Berlin in retaliation for the airstrikes on Cuba, then we'd be forced to defend the people of Berlin, which would lead to a war between the two superpowers, which would end up in nuclear holocaust. That was the discussion. Now, Kennedy listens to LeMay, who's representing the military, and he simply thanks the committee and dismisses them from his office. Okay? You might want to write that down. So, after listening to LeMay and the military's recommendations, and I think you can keep that in your thought process, I don't know how much you need to write down, but if you need to write it down, you can go back to the website video and get it. But after listening to LeMay and having that not so positive conversation, President Kennedy thanked XCOM and dismissed himself back into his office. They were in the cabinet room. He dismissed himself back in his office. Just basically left him there and went into his office. Who joined him to continue to evaluate the situation or to evaluate what they had just gone through? Who joined the president in his office? Bobby? Kenneth O'Donnell. Okay, keep that in mind. So after the president thanked the committee for for their actions, he basically left him in the cabinet room and went to his office, and he was joined by his brother and Kenneth O'Donnell. Now, what do you think the reaction is of General LeMay, General Taylor, former Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who's kind of a hardline, non-communist type guy? What do you think their reaction was when the president said thank you and simply went into his office? What do you think their reaction was?
He didn't like the idea.
They were pissed. Because what were they expecting the president to do?
Give
Give them the go-ahead for airstrikes and invasion. Now, Kennedy knows that's not a very good idea, right? Because he knows what that's going to lead to. LeMay probably is somewhat right in his statement that they'll do nothing because the only alternative they have is when they can't choose. Kennedy doesn't believe they won't do nothing. If we go in there and airstrike and kill Soviet soldiers who are on the ground in Cuba, they're going to respond, and they're going to go to Berlin. There's just no doubt about it. So, it starts to get interesting here. So, Kennedy decides that he's going to hang tight before he really makes a decision. Has he totally said, no, we're not going to do airstrikes yet? No, he hasn't. Well, ironically, late that afternoon of the 18th, he had an appointment with Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko. It was set up weeks in advance. It just ironically happened on this day. So Kennedy had already scheduled an appointment to visit with Soviet diplomat Andrei Gromyko, who's on your ID sheet. And that appointment was made long before these missiles were even uncovered in Cuba. Didn't have anything to do with the crisis. Just by happenstance, he was going to meet with him. So what's Kennedy's idea before he makes a decision? What's he going to do here? He's going to feel out Gromyko and see what he knows about this, to see if he has any idea that he knows there's missiles in Cuba. Do you think Gromyko knows there's missiles in Cuba? Probably does. Okay, but Kennedy's not sure. So Kennedy's not going to do anything until he kind of meets with Gromyko, which is kind of a weird deal, and just see what his thoughts are.
He was a Soviet worker.
He was a Soviet diplomat that was in the United States. You know, a guy over here that was representing Russia. And Kennedy already had a meeting with him all set up, so this is kind of perfect timing, because Kennedy's going to kind of talk with him and feel him out and see what he knows about this, if anything. Okay? Because has Berlin always been a topic of discussion? Has Cuba always been a topic? Cuba's been a topic of discussion since the Truman administration. Okay, so the two meet in the Oval Office and they discuss several things. And you should know the things that they discussed. They discussed. So keep in mind that they're going to have a meeting and Gromyko has no idea that Kennedy knows anything about any missiles in Cuba. Okay, and we don't know for sure at this point whether Gromyko knows anything about any missiles in Cuba, but the thought process is he probably does. So when they met in the Oval Office, first thing that happened is that Gromyko suggested that the United States should stop threatening Cuba. Okay, Gromyko suggested to the President that the United States should stop threatening Cuba. Now, you're thinking to yourself, I'm sure, well, oh, why would he say that? This has been going on forever. Cuba's been an ally of Russia forever, so to speak. We've always hated Cuba. We wanted to kill Castro way back before Kennedy ever got into office, so Cuba's always been an issue. We've been wanting to bomb the hell out of Cuba for years, but we know we can't do it because of what the repercussions might be. Now, Gromyko further states, because there's all, do you think we're sending spy planes around Cuba because we think there might not be missiles there? Why are we doing that? Why are we sending these spy planes and taking photographs? Because we never want Cuba to ever have nuclear weapons. That's why we're doing this. Okay, so it wasn't we weren't just like shocked beyond belief when we saw the missiles. We were certainly shocked, but the reason we were flying those flights is to make sure nothing like that ever happened in Cuba. Okay, so Gromyko in this meeting further stated that the Soviet Union would only supply Cuba with agricultural assistance, never would consider ever putting any offensive weapons in Cuba. So during this meeting, the topic's Cuba. The topic probably would have been Cuba even if this would not have happened, because there's always this long-standing conflict between Cuba and the United States, because the United States doesn't like communist Cuba 90 miles away. They don't like Fidel Castro, nor do they like his methods. That's why they planned the Bay of Pigs invasion during the Eisenhower administration. Okay? So Gromyko basically suggests that the United States should stop threatening Cuba. He further states that the Soviet Union would never consider sending anything other than agricultural assistance to Cuba, and they would never ever consider furnishing offensive weapons to Cuba. So Kennedy's just keeping a straight face because he knows what? He's just lying to him. I mean, he's lying right to his face. Matter of fact, he makes a comment, that lying bastard, after he left the meeting. He said that to his brother. I mean, he kept a straight face because he didn't want Gromyko to know that he knew anything. And it was kind of interesting because Kennedy continued to talk about the fact that supplying Cuba with weapons would have a profound effect on the relationship between Russia and the United States. Gromyko assured the president that the sole objective of Russia was to bring bread to Cuba in order to prevent hunger, and they're going on with this conversation. And it kind of reminded me when I was in administration, a kid did something wrong. I'd always ask them about 2 or 3 times if they did anything with the caveat that if you tell me the truth, I'm going to punish you the minimum, but if you lie to me, I'm going to crush you. And so I'd say to kids several times, now, are you sure that you don't know anything? Oh, now wait a minute, now take it into consideration that I'm going to treat you a lot differently if I get the truth. And by the 3rd time I ask them, what did kids do sometimes? Most of the time, they tell me the truth. Well, Kennedy kind of did the same thing. He repeated, now, there's no misunderstanding here on the position of the United States. You understand that we would never allow offensive weapons into Cuba. You get that. Oh, I get that, Mr. President. We would never send anything but agricultural assistance to help feed that country. Would never send offensive weapons. Now, you're sure you're clear on that we couldn't stand for that. That would be a big problem for us. So Kennedy just kept giving him every chance in the world to say something, and Gromyko assured Kennedy he understood everything he said. Thanks for having the meeting. Goodbye. We'll meet again some other time. So basically, what does Gromyko do by the time he leaves? He denies that there's any missiles in Cuba, or he also denies that those 25 Soviet ships that are going to Cuba have what on them? Agricultural supplies, no missiles. And Kennedy used that to perfection. So he knew, he was upset. He called Gromyko a lying bastard. And then he went into the office, his office, and met with who to talk about it again? Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell. So after speaking with Gromyko and making it real clear and trying to give him every opportunity in the world to fess up, Gromyko never did, and Kennedy was mad. Now, did Gromyko know for sure whether they did or not? That's still to be determined, but Kennedy believes he did. Well, what day of the week is this again? Thursday. Well, Kennedy was scheduled for a campaign trip to Chicago the next day on Friday. Okay? He was scheduled for because, you know, he's going to run for re-election in '64, and although it's only '62, it's late in '62, and they're making the move. So Kennedy already had it on his schedule that the next day he was going to go to Chicago. And what did he want to do because of the crisis? Not go. Okay? Well, Bobby and Kenneth O'Donnell said, you know, that's not going to work. It's just like it was in Connecticut. If you alter your schedule, we'll have a problem. Then they kind of got after him a little bit. This guy right here, Mayor Richard Daley, was the mayor of Chicago at this time. And he supposedly had pretty good ties with who? In Chicago. What? The Mafia. Okay, there was a lot of mafia organizations in Chicago. A lot of underworld things going on. The Teamsters Union, Jimmy Hoffa. A lot of interesting things going on. Well, rumor was that Richard Daley was right in the middle of all that. You know what I mean? And he was the mayor of Chicago. And he really was expecting the president to get there. The state of Illinois really supported Kennedy in this election. Matter of fact, there's some rumor that Joe Sr. met with Daley and some other important people from that organization and helped his son win that state. And so Richard Daley kind of felt like Kennedy owed him a few things, and because of that help in the election of 1960, Kenneth O'Donnell was kind of teasing the president, says, you cancel on Daley, I dare you. I'm not afraid to cancel on Daley. Well, you'll never cancel on Daley. I'll just get on the phone and cancel right now. Anyway, after Kennedy thought about it, he decided not to cancel on Daley. And so it was kind of a humorous thing because they didn't want him to go because it would give up things to the press. But on the other end, they were giving him crap that you'd never cancel on Richard Daley. You never, you know, he might come get you. And so you'll see that in the video. It's kind of comical.
Are we starting Friday now?
Nope, not yet. Now, as they discussed this trip to Chicago on Friday, the president really needs something from Bobby by the time he gets back. He needs a decision from XCOM to do what? Either blockade or airstrikes. So before he left that evening, President Kennedy insisted to his brother that you have got to get a consensus from XCOM while I'm gone. You got to talk him into either a blockade or airstrikes. We got to have a consensus. We got to have support. So while I'm gone, you got to have this thing done. Now, did he want to split? Did he want a 6-4 vote? I don't know how many people we have, but did he want a close vote? He wanted a consensus, because if he doesn't have a consensus, this would be seemed as a weakness by our government. We have to be all for one, one for all. He didn't want the Soviet Union believing that we were indecisive among our own people. So he tells Bobby, listen, when I get back to Chicago, I need something here. Now, he wasn't coming back, scheduled to come back until Saturday. Okay, this is Thursday. So he was going to go Friday and come back Saturday. That was the original plan. Now, that'll change a little bit, but that was the deal. So after he talks with Gromyko, they come in and visit with that a little bit. The concern is the president's scheduled for a campaign trip to Chicago. Kennedy doesn't want to go because of the crisis. Both Kenneth O'Donnell and Bobby tell him you got to keep up your schedule. And of course, Kenneth O'Donnell gets on him a little bit about, you know, he's chicken. He'd never cancel on Daley and all. He said, oh yeah, I would. And finally, he didn't. But anyway, before he left, he told Bobby, I got to have a consensus by Saturday, either blockade or airstrikes. It can't go any longer, and I need a consensus. I don't want any wishy-washy. All for one, one for all. Got to have it. Okay? Now, we move on to Friday, October 19th.